Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first storm of the month of 2023. Today I'm going to be talking to you about last year's July 26th landspout tornado event. So I'm going to quickly summarize the environment and then we're going to kind of walk through the visualizations of what the mesoanalysis was showing. So first big thing to note is there was a surface low located over east central Colorado, very close to our boundary with Boulder and then over the Palmer Divide. And with that surface low there was a stationary frontal boundary that also had an area of surface vorticity maximized alongside it, which you'll be seeing a little bit later on. This environment was not lacking for CAPE. The surface space was more than 3,000 joules with unstable lapse rates of 7 or more. And there was plenty of shear, despite it being a lighter wind day. So that said, let's kind of delve into it a little bit more and see what happened. So here's a look at the surface environment. I have boxed out in this slide purple, where you can see the area of focus, and this is going to be where the landspouts formed and then kind of inflicted themselves. So what you're seeing with the surface analysis is we had a corridor of warmer temperatures, generally in the 70s to mid 80s, with dew points in the 60s. So it's a fairly warm day with light winds. And you can kind of clearly see through where that boundary sets up and that narrower gradient sticks out, especially towards the middle and later half of the loop as it slides down from southern Yuma and then across Kit Carson County. Looking at the frontogenesis, so we are aware we had that near stationary boundary. Well, this kind of shows you where that frontogenesis set up. And it kind of peaked right before it moved into Kit Carson County, and that's going to be about the 22 to 23Z time frame, and then begin to weaken around 0Z and then later on, so as it's moving along and south of the interstate. Looking at a time lapse of the lapse rates in the mid-levels, generally seeing lapse rates of around 7 to 7.5, so remaining unstable, fairly warm day. A lot of the cooler lapse rates are going to be over to the east and more of the EML along the Rockies. Bulk shear, you can really see that nice narrow gradient, it's nearly tight I would say, move through Yuma County and then into Kit Carson. It does broaden just a little bit towards the end. And with that, we're seeing generally 45 to 50 knots of bulk shear. That's pretty zonal. So that's going to be generally setting up along that boundary. Looking at the low-level wind shear, the wind shear is coming out of the south, and it's fairly light, generally with an increase happening about 22Z, so as that boundary is really starting to develop those storm clusters, and we kind of see an increase to about 20 knots, so fairly light shear, but our bulk shear is still kind of heavy. So something I wanted to break out and kind of get us used to looking at are these wrap soundings. That's a newer option within the SPC mesoanalysis page. So with this, what you can mainly see over the areas of concern is going to be the amount of drier air. So again, we have about a 10 to 20 dew point deficient compared to our temperatures. And you're seeing that aloft, and then we do have a decent amount of CAPE. So not too worried about getting those storms to fire up as they develop. Looking at our storm motion and the supercell composite. So generally with this, we are looking at a right mover storm motion that does follow along how this complex went. It's moving towards the south, and we see that narrow gradient of those supercell parameters. Generally, we weren't expecting anything supercellular with this. It was mainly expected to be just a landspout day. However, I do have a twist in a little bit later that I'll talk about. But do note that we did have that little localized pocket of a 4 and higher on the supercell scale as it moved into Kit Carson County. Looking at the left mover, and this is just kind of have a good feel of what the environment really was showing. We do have it pulling out of the southwest, moving to the northeast, so counteractive flow. Not a lot going on in terms of a supercell composite there. So delving in a little bit more on the cape, so looking at the mixed layer cape and SIN, we do have a little bit of SIN, generally about 25 to 75 joules, which having a little bit of SIN is not a problem on those landspout days. It's okay to have that. And we do have up to 2,500 joules of cape here. You can kind of see as it falls along that boundary south of Yuma and into Kit Carson how that kind of folds down. So looking at the mixed layer cape overlaid on the surface vorticity, which this is something I've seen most of us in the office using when we're looking at landspout potential, is where are we seeing those two things overlap? Well, we had a pretty good amount of overlapping occurring, especially along that boundary, which is where we were watching for an area of concern. So what about the mean wind? How is that in comparison? We've looked at the storm motions, we've looked at the shear, saw that was kind of zonal. Well, looking at the mean wind, we do see it's basically zonal towards the end of the time lapse, so around the evening time frame, we do start to see a transition to the northwest flow, but that's a little bit later than what we're eyeing for that prime storm development. But generally it's pretty light. You're looking at about 10 to 15 knots with most of that time frame. So now that we've kind of talked about the mesoanalysis, let's look at satellite. So this is a screenshot from AWIPS that was taken and used in a graphic, and I just kind of blew it up. So I don't have the exact time, but based off the timing of the graphic, I would say it was about noon when this occurred. So you can see fairly well in the yellow highlighted area that boundary starting to really develop those cloud structures, and that's going to end up leading to our convection. So this is just a time lapse of the event from the storms really developing and then moving south. So you can see, I will have a zoomed in panel on the next slide. But really focus on where you start to see that supercellular look develop. That is something that I'm kind of wondering if it is a rare case of a hybrid supercell. And we'll kind of talk about that just a little bit more as we zoom in. But I'll let this play one more time just so we can catch it all. So you see those storms really firing up along the boundary over in Yuma County. We're starting to get those landspout reports around this time. And then as it moves into Stratton. Alright, so go on to the next slide. So as promised, here is a 4-panel of the velocity, correlation coefficient, and the ZDR, so you can kind of get a look at what was happening. And this is zoomed in to mainly when we were seeing a lot of the Stratton reports and then the Vona tornado itself. So I really wanted to look into this supercell structure. I was trying to look into some literature, and apparently it is very rare, but a landspout event can morph into a supercell. So that is what I'm kind of thinking is happening here. Plan to do a little more research on that. But we do see a pretty good amount of rotation starting about now, and that's where we're really starting to see the core of those Stratton reports and really seeing a lot of the beautiful structure there. And then that kind of continues as it moves a little bit along that left motion we were seeing earlier. into Vona and then produces the damaging tornado there. All right. So let's take a look at what happened with this event. So with this, we did have our first funnel reported at about 3:30. So keep in mind that satellite picture that I showed you earlier was about noon. So about 3 hours from that, we started seeing reports of things. And these tornadoes were very visualized. We had a lot of information coming in from along I-70, the towns. We had a report as far south as Cheyenne Wells, seeing the funnels or landspouts. So this was a very well viewed event. Over a span of about an hour, we had a total of 4 tornadoes. We had an EF0 in Vona, which caused the structure damage you can see right here. So this is just some of the damage. So it did shift the building to the east off of its foundation. It bent over a communications tower on the property. And then some of the other damage included the propane tank rolled a little bit and a damage to a swing set and some of the siding on the home itself. Luckily, these property owners were not there. They were at the fair in Burlington. There was also a ranking of EF unknowns for the 2 landspouts north of Stratton, just because they stayed in wide open space. There really wasn't anything for it to hit, and we had no other reports. And then we had another EF1 southeast of Kirk. Now, the focus of this event, or this Storm of the Month video, is not on everything that happened with this system. We did have some hail reports, both in Kit Carson County, which, as you can see, we had up to 1.25 inches. But we also had some hail later on, about 7 to 8 p.m. in, I want to say, Greeley and Wichita counties. So it did eventually move over and produce a few more reports. But most of the tornadic activity was centered over Kit Carson itself. With that, we issued 8 warnings, half of them verified, and we had an average lead time of about 6.2 minutes for every event. So how did we message this? This is something I think we did a fairly good job of. We issued a landspout watch SPS for Stratton to Burlington to Binkelman line. And that's generally what you were going to see on that satellite loop. That was kind of us messaging that potential. Now with that, we did have to reissue the SPS watch a few times due to expirations. And with those, we did narrow that down to an area of concern from Siebert, St. Francis, and then into Atwood. So really kind of honed in along where that boundary was setting up. In the earlier time frame of this event, we did provide an 800 megahertz briefing to our partners, and then there was communication on NWS chat to them as well, really relaying what we were seeing and what to expect with those hazards. We did issue our first landspout SPS for the landspout that was reported southeast of Kirk, and then over the next hour we issued a variety of landspout SPSs and tornado warnings, and those tornado warnings were mainly issued for the Vona area and then Stratton, the actual town, as it moved closer. And again, kind of watching with Vona, was that a hybrid supercell tornado? There was that mid-level rotation, which I did not show. So that is something to kind of look in a little bit more, but for the sake of this and what we've done in the past with the storm entries for this, it is considered a landspout. So I'm going to end it here with this timeline so we can really visualize how this event rolled out from messaging all the way through the last warning. So we started off with an 800 megahertz briefing about 1730Z, and that was just letting our partners know what was going on. And then about 2 hours later, we issued our first landspout watch SPS for that broad area that was highlighted in the satellite graphic. About an hour later, because of the durations of SPSs, we did have to kind of hone that in and reissue. And we kept issuing these based off our higher confidence with what was going on. So we did a fairly good job of relaying our confidence and getting products out. We did our final landspout watch SPS about 2135Z. Just a little over 10 minutes later, we did have our first landspout reported southeast of Kirk. And with that, looking at the time between the first watch and the landspout report, it was about 2 hours and 9 minutes. So we did a great job of putting those products out, relaying our confidence, and it kind of came to fruition. So we had a good lead time for that. Looking at, we did shortly issue a landspout SPS for that storm because it did continue to create landspouts. And then as that storm moved closer to Stratton, around 22Z, we issued an actual tornado warning as it was going to impact the town. And then about 30 minutes later, the Stratton cell had let up and had recycled and was kind of having a southwest projection as it produced a tornado that hit Vona and crossed I-70. So we did have an SPS out. However, due to the EM calling us with the damage report, we did go ahead and issue that tornado warning around 2231Z. And then our final report for Kit Carson and associated with the subject of this came about 23Z with a report of 1-inch hail south of Stratton. So overall, this was a really good warning event for us. We kind of had our heads up and were able to message to the partners and may have helped us have more of an eye in the sky. And I want to thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know.